Okay. As you can see, one of the things with summer is it kind of flies by. We are entering another week, or let's say we're wrapping up another week, and we'll be entering another one as we move up to July. And again, we don't have a whole lot of time. Again, things go fast, but you've got exam one out of the way. That was your 50-point exam, so it gives you a good idea of sort of what this class looks like with the small exam. And before you know it, we'll have another exam. It'll be a big 100-point exam. I'll announce that in a second. So exam one's out of the way. The due date closed, or I guess it closed Wednesday evening. I checked the grade book. It looks like everybody took it. So if you need to or want to, you should be able to now go into the grade book, and if you click on your test in the grade book, it will let you view your questions. I believe I have it set up that you get to see the question, you get to see the answer you selected, as well as what the correct answer would have been. So go through and check your exams and look at anything that you kind of missed and see if you have questions about that. Okay, that's first. So exam one's out of the way. Again, it should be open. Make sure you go check on it. Number two. All right. Today, my plan is to wrap up the material that covers tissues. I will be able to do that, I think, today and get all the way through tissues. What I'm then going to do is sometime before this weekend, I hope to have it up by this evening, I am going to post a Blackboard quiz that covers just the tissues. It will be a 10-point quiz. It will be in Blackboard, just like your other exams and quizzes were. All right, so like that terminology quiz, I am posting a Blackboard quiz. It will cover the tissues, everything that I get through today in regards to the tissues. 10 questions, 10 points, and it will be due by the end of the day Sunday. Again, this is a Blackboard quiz. It will be due by the end of the day Sunday. Just like the terminology quiz, it's 10 questions, 10 points. It can be a mix of multiple choice and true false. Again, you'll have a 10-minute timer set on that quiz. So again, make sure you pay attention to that. I'll shoot, when I have the quiz and Blackboard completed and loaded, I'll send out an email. So when you see that, you know it should be available. Okay, that's the second thing. All right, most important, and this goes out to everybody, hopefully, that you're watching the Zoom meetings. Next week on Tuesday and Thursday, I will be out of town and I don't know about my internet access. So I am not having Zoom lectures on Tuesday and Thursday of next week. That is the week of Monday, June 29th through Sunday, July 5th. So whatever that Tuesday and Thursday of next week, I will not have a Zoom lecture. Again, I'm out of town Tuesday and Thursday. I don't know about the internet, so I don't want to rely on that and then get stuck. So you will not have Zoom meeting or lectures next week. You will, however, have assignments. They will be visible body assignments. So you will have stuff to do next week. Sometime between Monday and Sunday of next week, I will post 2 visible body assignments. All right. One of the visible body assignments is going to be on the integumentary system. So just like the last time, you need to go through the integument system modules that I post in visible body. There will be practice quizzes in visible body. You can take the practice quizzes as many times as you like. I will then also post a graded quiz on the integument. It will have a due date of Sunday, July 5th, so as long as you finish it before Sunday, July 5th. So you have the integument module in visible body. You will have practice quizzes. You can take the practice quizzes as many times as you like. And you will have a graded quiz. The visible body graded quiz, you can only take once. The due date for all that, whether it's the practice quizzes or the graded quiz in visible body, you will have a due date of Sunday, July 5th. All right. I will also post a visible body assignment that covers the bones and skeletal system. Those were the lectures we were supposed to do next week. So the integument and then bones and skeletal system. So the bones and skeletal system also will have a set of modules It will have practice quizzes and a graded quiz. Again, all of that is due by Sunday, July 5th. So I'm going to open the bit. Today we're wrapping up tissues. You will have a Blackboard quiz over tissues that is due by this Sunday. Next week, since I will be gone, I'm going to give you assignments in visible body, and they cover the integument and they cover bones and skeletal system. You can have all week to do the integument and bones and skeletal system. The due date for both the integument and the skeletal system on visible body will have a due date of Sunday, July 5th. So next week, while I'm gone, you have to do visible body stuff. It will be posted in there. I'll send out an email for it. All right. Visible body, whether it's the integument stuff or the bones and skeletal chapter in the visible body, they'll both have practice quizzes. You can take as much as you like, but you will also, for both the integument and for the bones and skeletal system, there will be a graded quiz for each of those. The graded quiz is one opportunity. Okay, so the due date for all of that is July 5th. Again, like I mentioned last time, discussion board exams and things like that, anything in Blackboard automatically is loaded to the grade book. Visible body stuff, I have to manually put in. I plan to start doing some of that today, getting visible body grades moved over to there. So that's what you will have for next week. Now, I think I'm going to have some kind of internet. Whether it's on my phone, I'll be able to check my email. So if you have questions, just reach out and ask. I'll try to, as much as I can, check my email. And so try to get hold of me, shoot me an email and all that kind of stuff, and I'll respond as soon as I can. All right. With that being said, if some disaster occurs, shoot me an email. We can cover it when I get back. All right. So that's the plan. Okay. So that covers all the quizzes, all that junk that you have going on. And it covers us wrapping up tissues. It covers what you'll have to do for next week. Again, I will check email as much as I can. So shoot me an email if you run into questions or have problems. All right. So with that being said, the week after July 5th, we will resume our Zoom lectures. I will send an email again prior to the start of that week. So hopefully by Saturday, Sunday, July 4th and July 5th, I'll send in an email when I'm back in town and let people know that the Zoom meetings are coming back, and that would be my plan. So that's, again, we won't have a Zoom meeting till Tuesday, July 7th. Here's the plan for Tuesday, July 7th. On that day, I'll start the Zoom meeting and I'll see if there are questions in regards to any of the activities that you were doing in visible body. We'll have a chance to review a little bit, and then I'm going to wrap up the information on bones and skeleton and have a lecture on joints. That is because on Thursday, July 9th, you have your next exam. All right. So there'll be some time question-wise on that Tuesday in case there's questions or concerns or things about information in the material. We'll wrap that up, and then you'll have an exam on Thursday, July 9th. So I'll have the exam that opens on then. We can discuss that as it gets closer. All right, so that's kind of where we're going. That covers all the junk that we have for, again, today, next week, and the following week after that. Okay, so if you are not here live and are watching the Zoom lecture, if you have questions about it, reach out, shoot me an email, and I'll try to answer those. Otherwise, at the end of the lecture today, for all of you that are in attendance, if you have questions, again, I'll hang out at the end of this lecture and try to address any concerns that you have. Okay, so, all right, lecture time. So when we left off last time, we were wandering through talking about epithelial tissue. I introduced the basic tissues of the body, and we're going to continue working through that. Again, the four basic tissue types: you have epithelial, you have connective, you have muscle, and you have nervous tissue. So we're wandering through that. And when I was here last time, we essentially got through part of your epithelial tissue. So I want to pick up there. All right, if you remember when we were here last time and I was covering the epithelial tissue, we had finished by talking about epithelial tissue has two basic surfaces, two sides of them. There's the apical side, it is exposed to the cavity, and there's the basal side. It is not exposed to the cavity, it's the underlying part. It is the portion of your epithelial tissue. So if this is an epithelial cell or your epithelial tissue, it has two sides. The apical side lines the cavity. This is the side also that generally has some kind of specializations. And again, on that, the other day, I talked about it having specializations like microvilli, or it has might have cilia, but modifications for the functioning of that epithelial tissue. Your basal side of the cell of that epithelial tissue is the side that is always connected to your underlying connective tissue. Remember, epithelial tissue is avascular. It does not have its own blood supply. So the only way it's able to get its nutrients is via diffusion from your underlying connective tissue. Here, where they are fused together on the basal side, there is the basement membrane. Remember, the basement membrane is produced by both epithelial tissue as well as connective tissue. And so your epithelial tissue, the basal side of that epithelial tissue secretes a basal lamina, and your connective tissue secretes a reticular lamina. So the basement membrane is a structure produced by both the epithelial tissue and connective tissue. It's like the Velcro holding each of those together. The basement membrane has a basal lamina, that's the structure produced by the epithelial tissue, and there's a reticular lamina, that's the structure produced by the connective tissue. That is where I left off last time. All right, so moving forward then, if we look at then being able to create categories, your epithelial tissue can be divided and distinguished by two main things. All right, so now we're going to go through and look at examples of specific epithelial tissues and look at how we tell them apart. All right, you may have done some of this already in your lab, but we're going to build on that idea. Your epithelial tissue can be distinguished by either its shape or the number of layers. Shape or the number of layers. When we talk about shape, we're talking about essentially what it looks like, all right? And it can be squamous. And squamous means scale up or squished. It's flat, in other words. And when you look at the nucleus, it's almost like the nucleus is sandwiched in that flat cell. There is cuboidal. Cuboidal, exactly like it sounds, a cube. A square, your nucleus generally takes up much of that cube or cell. It's not sandwiched within it. And then there is columnar. Columnar is shaped like a column. Your nucleus sits off to one side distinctly, does not take up most of the cell. So we can look at epithelial tissue and start to distinguish it by its overall shape. Is it squished, squamous-like, cuboidal, or columnar? Or we can look at the number of layers. In general, there's a couple of things we distinguish this. There are essentially three types of layers. There is simple, and simple means one cell layer. There is stratified. Stratified is two or more, or just multiple layers, anything more than one, if you will. Oops. Or we have something called pseudo stratified. Pseudo means false, so it is falsely stratified. It has to do with its shape, all right? And it has an irregular shape, which means when you look at it, it's hard to distinguish whether it is one or multiple layers. So pseudo stratified is technically one cell layer that looks like multiple. And it looks like multiple when you look at it under the microscope. And I'll try to explain a little bit about what that means here, or show you what I mean by that. Because the overall shape of the cells oftentimes is not uniform and they overlap. When you look at them straight down like this, it's hard to tell that it's technically only one layer along here. So we have one layer of cells, but when you look down on the top of them, because they overlap, it makes them look like it's more than one. That's what pseudo-stratified is. All right, and there are 8 different types of epithelial tissue. It's pretty straightforward if you, for the most part, put the shape and the number of layers together. All right, you can at least come up with 6. So here's what, and you're responsible for these 8 types. And in a second, I'm going to introduce a primary function and some locations. And you are responsible for those things as well. Number 1, there is simple squamous epithelium. I'm not going to write out epithelium. I assume you know it's because we're talking about epithelial. Simple squamous. And so here's what that essentially means. I'm not going to do this for each one. Simple. It's one cell layer and they're all squished. So in other words, I have a sheet one sheet of squished cells. We'll come back to function location in just a second. You can do simple cuboidal. One layer of cuboidal cells. Or we can do simple columnar. Obviously, one layer of column-shaped cells. Okay, pretty straightforward. The next type. So now if we just start with the next number of layer types, now we can do stratified squamous. And obviously now what you end up having is more than one layer of squamous cells. So I sort of draw it, it almost looks like a big giant brick wall. So what I'm drawing here now and then if we divide those up, what you're looking at here is a layer of squamous cells, a layer of squamous cells, a layer of squamous cells. So that's what it means to be stratified. They're all squamous, they're flat, and there's more than one layer. We can do stratified cuboidal. I'm not going to keep drawing because I think you get the picture now. Number 6, stratified columnar. And then we have 2 leftover groups. This is where we throw in our pseudo stratified columnar. Again, all stratified. The cells are sort of vary in that columnar shape, but they overlap. It's only one layer, but it looks like multiple. And then there's this extra one that we call transitional epithelium. And I'll discuss that as I go through the functions and locations. All right, so I'm just going to list out for each of these. You need to be responsible for those. Here we go. All right, now it helps as we sort of introduce these to think about why it has a specific function. So think about the number of layers and its shape, and that'll help you remember its function and location. Now, I'm going to mention a couple things. For a lot of these, there is more than one function. All right, you may have had to learn more than one function in lab. For each of these, am going to give you the primary function. So here's what's most important. When I ask you a test question, it will be based off my giving you the primary function that I want you to know. Even though there may be others, they are generally secondary functions. So I'm going to list the primary function and a couple of locations, and you are responsible for that. All right, simple squamous. Its main function is diffusion. So again, think about that. You have, if things are going to diffuse, move down their concentration gradient, well, imagine you have a material over here, like oxygen, that has to diffuse over here into your blood. Well, for oxygen to get there, it has to diffuse across and go past the cell membrane of the cell on this side. It has to go through all the cytoplasm here and across the cell membrane on that side. Now, we want our oxygen to diffuse quickly. So if you have a nice flat cell, then that occurs more readily than, say, for example, moving oxygen from here across a cell membrane still, but now look at the distance it would have to travel across that cytoplasm before going over here. So one of the main functions for simple squamous epithelium is for the process of diffusion. Material can diffuse rapidly across a smaller surface area, or surface, if you will. So here's a couple of locations. Number one, and I'm going to write this one out because it's weird. In your kidneys, there's a structure called a glomerulus. All right, it is where you first start producing urine. I'm introducing this now. You'll hear much more about it in A&P2. So now when you get to that, it's something you can remember. All right, so one of the locations for simple squamous is in your kidney glomerulus. In addition, all of your capillaries, all right, all of your capillaries of the body are made of simple squamous epithelium. And I'll write out one more, your alveoli. Your alveoli are the structures in your lungs where oxygen is diffusing. So it's how the oxygen you breathe in moves out of your lungs and into your blood. It's going from the alveoli. Those are simple squamous tissues as well. In addition, those serosal layers that I talked about, all right, peritoneum, pericardium, pleura, those serosal layers, they also have or contain simple squamous epithelium. All right, simple cuboidal. A main function for simple cuboidal is secretion, to secrete a product. All right. It is also found in your kidneys, but it is found in your kidney tubules. Again, I introduce this now because you will come back and talk about that as you introduce the kidneys when you're in A&P2. The tubules of your kidneys, again, as you're producing urine, is made of simple cuboidal epithelium. The ducts of the body. So when we talk about a duct, again, that would be like an oil duct you have, or a sweat gland, sweat duct that produces sweat. All of those are made of simple cuboidal epithelium. And a good portion of the female ovaries. are made of simple cuboidal epithelium. All right, the next one is simple columnar. Simple columnar's main function is absorption, so to absorb a product. And there are two main places you find simple columnar for the process of absorption: along your digestive tract, absorption of the nutrients of your food, and again, portions of the female uterus, reproductive system, if you will. There's also stratified squamous. All right, for each of these stratified, you're looking at multiple layers. So when we introduce number 4, 5, and 6 here, all of these stratified, and again, they have secondary functions, but primarily the reason you have multiple layers of cells is protection. So the main function for any of the stratified, whether it's stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, or stratified columnar, their main function is some degree of protection. The main location for stratified squamous, it is found making up your skin and in your oral cavity. So in other words, your skin and the lining of your mouth. Stratified cuboidal, many of the large glands that make up your body consist of stratified cuboidal epithelium. And there's stratified columnar. Stratified columnar is found in the male urethra. All right. That's again a structure involved with the kidneys, bladder, making urine, or leading out of the body, if you will. All right, the male urethra and the pharynx. Again, you'll introduce and hear these again as you do A&P2. Your pharynx, you think of that, that's your throat. All right. In other words, leading from your mouth into your stomach eventually, your throat. There's pseudostratified columnar. The main job for pseudostratified columnar is secretion, to secrete material, and it is found along the upper respiratory tract. So when we say upper respiratory tract, it's basically the mouth leading to the lungs. Again, you'll hear it again. You'll see these again introduced when you do A&P2. So it's a 2-for-1 here. Pseudostratified columnar, secretion. Again, it secretes mucus that helps trap debris before it gets to the lungs, things like that. So it is secreting a product and it's found in the upper respiratory tract. And then the transitional. Transitional is a weird one. It is made, its main function is expansion. The cells themselves overlap. The cells themselves overlap, so they're relatively flat. They sort of overlap. You can almost think of it like an accordion. And the entire structure would be made that way. It is built to expand. In other words, when it expands, those cells can slide down past one another to essentially make a bigger structure, if you will. And where you find it is in the ureters. That's again part of the urinary system, and your bladder. I'll introduce this part, it'll make the most sense. Think about when you produce urine and your bladder fills up so that it stretches and you're like, or it's better to say expands, and you know that you have to go to the bathroom. Oh my gosh, I have to pee so bad. That is because you have that structure, that bladder, a little circle like a balloon, has just filled up with urine. And much like a balloon expands as it fills with air, the same thing is true for this transitional epithelium. Your bladder, as it fills up with urine, it begins to stretch and make a larger structure. That's the main job. All right, so those are the 8 types, and those are essentially their primary function and several locations for those tissues in the body. Now, in addition to those functions, there's a couple of specialty functions that make epithelial tissue unique. Number one, they provide sensation. There's actually something, what we mean here by sensation, much of your epithelial tissue, even though it's not, doesn't have a blood supply, so it does not have a blood supply, we say it's avascular, it does generally have a good nerve supply. You may even hear the word neuroepithelium. You'll certainly hear it again when you get to ANP2, but neuroepithelium, nerves to epithelial tissue. And so much of your epithelial tissue has a very good nerve supply. Take, for example, that your skin, all right, is an epithelial tissue. It has a nerve supply in there. Along your mouth, along your nose, all right? When you smell something, your ability to process that has to do with the nerve supply and that epithelial layer. So it does provide sensation. In addition, another specialty function is all of the glands of your body are derived from epithelial tissue. So your glands are a type of epithelial tissue. And a gland, by definition, is just one or more cells that make and secrete a product. Now, you have two main types of glands in the body. You have an endocrine gland. Your endocrine glands, these are ductless glands, all right? They do not have a duct that leads to the body surface. Instead, what they do is your endocrine gland secretes something called a hormone. This is a chemical messenger. And that hormone is a chemical messenger that travels in your blood somewhere. So endocrine glands do not have a duct that leads to a body surface. They produce hormones that are secreted into your blood. I don't cover them much in ANP1. ANP2 does an entire chapter on the endocrine system. But again, even when you do that, that endocrine gland is a type of epithelial tissue. Endo means to secrete, or crine means to secrete. Endo means within. So you are secreting within the body. Exocrine, again, secrete outside. Exocrine glands all do have a duct. They are ducted to a body cavity or a body surface. So there is a duct that leads to a body surface or cavity. All right, I'll give you some examples and where you'll see it next week when you are all going through the integumentary system. You produce sweat. That is because there's a duct associated with an exocrine gland that releases sweat that then comes to the body surface. You have sebaceous glands. Those are producing oil, all right? When you have oily skin, that is an exocrine gland that has a duct that leads to the body surface. So exocrine glands secrete to the outside, secrete to a surface. All right, that is all the details about epithelial tissue. Now, as a side note, I spend much of the lecture for tissues covering epithelial and connective tissue. The reason that is because we go on to other organ systems, and I get you for a whole section on muscles and nervous tissue. So I'm going to introduce some basics here, but much of this lecture focuses on epithelial and connective tissue. Here's why. Epithelial and connective tissue are the building blocks really for our first organ system. That's the integument. You're going to do that next week when you get into visible body. So when we introduce connective tissue, there are four main classes of connective tissue. There are four main classes. There's what's called connective tissue proper. There is bone. There is cartilage. And there is blood. Some books call it fluid connective tissue because it includes blood and lymph, but I'm just putting it here as blood, but you may see it as fluid connective tissue. All right. So unlike epithelial tissue, where we went through 8 distinct types of epithelial tissue, connective tissue gets a bit more complicated because there are 4 classes, but then we're going to subdivide the different classes here. So we have main classes and then subdivisions. Again, this is different than epithelial tissue, which was pretty straightforward in its 8 categories. We have 4 main classes, and then we're going to divide this, subdivide these classes. Your connective tissue, whether it's connective tissue proper, bone, cartilage, or blood, has 3 basic components. So, in other words, there are some things that all connective tissue has in common. All right. Number 1, each category has a specialized type of cell. We're going to introduce those cells as we do each class. In addition, there is an extracellular protein fiber. So what we're looking at here is when we talk about specialized cells, there's some living cell and what supports that cell. There are extracellular protein fibers and there's a ground substance. Your ground substance can be hard, kind of like if it was bone, or it can be fluid, like if it was blood. So there's a specialized cell, and then there's protein fibers and ground substance. All right. This, B and C here, is often referred to as the matrix. All right. In other words, you have a living specialized cell that is suspended in some kind of non-living matrix. Let me try to give you an example what I mean by that. Take your house. All right. You live in your house. Your house is not alive. It's made of walls and sheetrock, and there's lights and electricity and all that kind of stuff. But your house is not alive. You are alive in your house. That's the equivalent here. So as we talk about a connective tissue, all right, take for example the one you're seeing above. Take for example your blood. Your blood is a type of connective tissue. Your blood is made of cells. You've heard of those, like red blood cells. All right. But there's also the non-living stuff, the matrix. And so when we talk about your blood, it's those living red blood cells, white blood cells. The non-living stuff is like the fluid. Your blood is watery. All right. There's also some protein fibers, electrolytes, things like that. That's the matrix. All right. So that's what the matrix means. This matrix is important because it is what provides and gives that, that connective tissue a lot of times its durability, its strength. Okay, a lot of times the matrix makes up the major proportion of that tissue. Okay, there's some general characteristics. Outline each of those. Your connective tissue is the most abundant tissue in the body. It's everywhere, all over, right? Remember, it underlies all of your epithelial tissue, so it is the most abundant tissue. It varies in vascularity. A lot of times you'll struggle with this idea here, but what that essentially means is, right, some connective tissue examples have a good blood supply. Others do not. I will introduce that as we go through. But what we mean by that is, as you're introducing these different ones, we'll talk about it may be that it has a good blood supply or is considered vascular, and it may be considered avascular depending on the specific connective tissue. Oops. All of your connective tissue is derived from mesenchyme. Mesenchyme is embryonic connective tissue that gives rise to all other connective tissues. In other words, when you're in your mother's womb, the first connective tissue that you make is mesenchyme. Mesenchyme then can differentiate into any of those 4 types above. It can then become a connective tissue proper. It can become your bone, it can become your blood, or it can become cartilage. But what you first make is mesenchyme. It is the precursor to all of your other connective tissues. Now, when we talk about the extracellular matrix, remember that's the fibers that you find embedded within the connective tissue. There are 3 main types of fibers. First type is collagen. This, of the fibers of the matrix, this is your strongest, and it is the most abundant fiber found in the body. It is the strongest and most abundant. It tends to be really thick. In general, it's white in color, and it does not branch. It is unbranched. In other words, think of it like a solid rope. You haven't tied any strings together. That would be a compromise point. In other words, I have one really strong, long fiber. Some of these others you'll see as it begins to branch, that creates a weak spot. All right, it serves a job, but your collagen fibers do not branch. They are really, really strong, especially when it's pulled end to end. So if you were to yank on that collagen fiber, it would be really difficult to tear it, at least to snap it. All right. This is what you find. It is the predominant fiber that makes up your tendons and ligaments. So collagen fibers, when you think of a tendon or a ligament of the body, this is the fiber that makes up that tendon or ligament. All right, elastic. This should be obvious. It contains a protein. That protein is called elastin. So it contains a protein called elastin. It allows or gives it the ability to stretch. So it can stretch and then recoil. Think of it like a rubber band. It stretches and then it comes back to its original shape. This tends to be thinner. They are yellow in color and they do branch. So the ability to stretch. You have elastic fibers in your skin. Pull up on your skin. Part of that ability to stretch without you tearing it and then flap back down is the elastic fibers that's in there. You find them in your lungs. So as you're breathing in and out and your lungs and chest is expanding, that's because of the elastic fibers within there. And many of the vessels, as blood flows through the vessels of your body, they have some degree of stretch because of the elastic fibers making it up. Reticular, it's sort of this overlap. It's what we think of as a sort of, it's, excuse me, it's like a thin version of collagen, all right? What it means by this is essentially it has very extensive branching, like your elastic fibers, all right? So it has extensive branching like your elastic fibers, but it's more similar to collagen in regards to its strength. And what this does is it creates sort of what we think is a big giant net of the body, all right? And like a net, support net, scroll down here a sec. One of the things it does here is it provides support. It helps to support your organs. It surrounds your organs. You find it within your capillaries, providing support for them. That's the main job of those. All right. So what we've just looked at is some of the protein fibers, some of the matrix categories that you have for the major classes of CT. So as we now look at those four main classes, we will talk about the cell. And as we talk about the cell too, we'll talk about some of the proteins that make it up. All right. What you need to understand is we have a predominant cell type for each of the tissues. And so this is where you get a little confused sometimes too. This connective tissue proper is a tissue. Cartilage is a tissue. Bone is a tissue. Blood is a tissue. All of these are types of connective tissue. Now, all of your connective tissue is composed of cells, but they are composed of cells and a matrix that they are suspended in. Right here, all I'm doing is going to talk about the predominant cell that makes up each one. Now, all of these started off as mesenchyme. So embryonically, you built mesenchyme, and then they differentiated into either connective tissue proper, into cartilage, into bone, or into blood. That took a transition. Think of it like you all, as you are growing up, you become a toddler, a teenager, eventually an adult. There's a transition as well here. Okay, what we end up having making these up is we have the immature cell type, and then you will produce the mature cell type that make up this tissue. For connective tissue proper, the immature cell is called a fibroblast. You can think of blast meaning a builder. It is a builder of your connective tissue proper. When it matures, it becomes a fibrocyte. Cyte means cell, so this is your mature cell. So you will find fibroblasts and fibrocytes making up connective tissue proper. Cartilage consists of chondroblasts. Chondro means cartilage, blast means builder, a builder of cartilage. When it matures, it is a chondrocyte. When we have bone, bone is an osteoblast, right? Builder, osteo means bone, a builder of bone. And when it matures, it is an osteocyte. And then blood. Blood's a little weird. Blood consists of what's called hematopoietic stem cells, or you may see hemocytoblasts. Again, you'll introduce how all this works when you get into ANP2. Hematopoietic stem cells or hematocytoblasts or hemocytoblasts, and you'll outline this. But these are the immature cell types. And when you have the mature cell types for blood, there are three main mature cell types. You have red blood cells, or they may be called erythrocytes. You have white blood cells, they are called leukocytes, or you have thrombocytes. That's what you know of though, as platelets. All right, and I'll come back to that a little bit later here as well. But those are then the mature cell types that make up each of those main classes. So what we want to do next is wander through looking at then the subclasses and functions for each of your connective tissues. All right, so the various types that we have here. All right. Connective tissue proper is essentially a big, you can think of it as a big, like broad trash can group. It seems like there's a bunch piled into connective tissue proper, all right? But essentially this tissue, these categories within connective tissue proper differ in the number. So for connective tissue proper, as we go through these subtypes, they differ based on the number of cell types that you find within it and the specific characteristics or specifics of the extracellular matrix. All right, so of the matrix. Okay, now we can subdivide connective tissue proper. So now if you take connective tissue proper, what are some examples of connective tissue proper? Well, it can be divided into two main types. There is loose connective tissue proper. So loose connective tissue is a type of connective tissue proper. This is where we say it has a bunch. When we say cell types, again, this is going to have the fibroblasts and fibrocytes. Because it's a connective tissue. All right, because it's a connective tissue proper, it has fibroblasts and fibrocytes. Remember, that's from back way up here. I just introduced connective tissue proper, it has to have fibroblasts and fibrocytes. But as we introduced and say that the cell types can differ, many of your loose connective tissue propers will have some other cell types as well. You might see embedded within it, all right, things called mast cells, or you might even have plasma cells embedded within it. There may be even fat cells embedded within it, adipocytes. You may have macrophages embedded in it. So in addition to this immature cell type or the fibroblasts, the main cell type, there's some other cells that you can see oftentimes in these loose connective tissues. Okay? Now, when we look at loose connective tissue, there are three main types of loose connective tissue. All right? So now, look, you have to keep this in line with what we're doing here. I'm going to come back to this when we get to the end. So you have a connective tissue proper, and one type of connective tissue proper is loose connective tissue. Loose connective tissue can further be subdivided into three main types. There's areolar, there's adipose, and there is reticular connective tissue proper. All right? Here's your areolar. Areolar is the most widely distributed connective tissue. Its job is to support and bind your tissues. All right. One of the things it does is it sort of tries to, it's supporting its binding tissues. It holds on to fluid. So it helps to maintain some of the watery environment of the body. Your adipose tissue you think of as fat. That fat, why do you have adipose tissue? It stores nutrients, so it's nutrient storage. For you, that means energy, essentially. It can provide padding, cushioning, if you will. It can act as a shock absorber. It can act as an insulator. All right, those are the main functions of your adipose tissue. And the body contains two main types. You as an adult mainly have something called white fat. The main job of your white fat is to store nutrients. Again, you put away fat for essentially a rainy day when you don't get to eat white fat. All right. You have another type of fat in the body. It's not as abundant. You have very, very little as an adult, and that is called brown fat. All right. Now, brown fat is essentially a consumer of energy. It consumes nutrients in a process called oxidative metabolism. That basically means this brown fat burns itself. Think of it as being like you could eat anything you want and you don't put on fat. It automatically burns itself. You do not have very much of this. You have very little as an adult. You did, however, have a good bit more when you were an infant. Infants contain brown fat. All right. Now, I have to make this point clear. Infants also contain white fat. Infants are good and chubby. They just also have a proportion of brown fat because infants aren't good at while they're at least young, aren't good at regulating their own body temperature like y'all do, like adults do. So they have this brown fat that sort of burns itself, helps the baby sort of maintain or try to regulate its body temperature. Again, I'm going to make this point clear though. Infants, little kids have both white fat and brown fat, but compared to you as an adult, infants have a bit more brown fat than you. They contain both types. There's also reticular connective tissue. Reticular connective tissue, again, contains reticular fibers. That's what I introduced above. Sort of netting, if you will. And we already talked about its job for support. Provides support, helps to hold things in place. You tend to find this, one of the locations for much of your reticular connective tissue, within your lymphatic system. It's within your spleen. It's within your bone marrow, are some of the major places where you have that supporting reticular connective tissue. All right. Your next type of connective tissue proper is called dense connective tissue. In your dense connective tissue, the predominant fiber, not the predominant cell, but the predominant fiber would be collagen fibers. All right. There are two main types of dense connective tissue. There is regular, and within here, all of the collagen fibers run in a parallel pattern. All right. Here's where you find dense regular connective tissue. Your dense regular connective tissue makes up your tendons, and a tendon is a structure that connects your muscle to your bone. So your muscle is connected to your bone by a tendon. That tendon is made up of regular dense connective tissue. So it's going to, so to make this clear in your head, this dense regular connective tissue is a type of connective tissue proper. So the cell you would find in it is fibroblasts and fibrocytes, and the predominant fiber would be collagen fibers. All right. In addition, all of the ligaments of your body are made of regular dense connective tissue. This is what attaches your bone to your bone. Again, when we introduced collagen fibers, we talked about their strength. Tendons and ligaments connect your bone or your muscle to your bone. In addition to dense connective, in addition to the regular, there is irregular. Irregular, the fibers are not parallel. The fibers are not parallel. Instead, they are all interwoven. That allows them to essentially resist tension or spread the force across a larger area. So, in addition to the, as I mentioned above, like elastic fibers you find making up your skin, much of your skin also contains irregular dense connective tissue. All right, this is actually part of the deeper portion of your skin. You'll see that probably when you go through visible body. Many of the joints of the body contain this as a building block. Many of your organs contain this. Now, before I get to cartilage, I'm going to try to illustrate sort of what I've wandered through here so that you can put it into a simpler map, if you will, or mindset. Okay, look, I introduced connective tissue proper. Remember, it has a predominant cell type, that's a fibroblast or a fibrocyte. Now, rather than just reading through your notes, you should recognize that for connective tissue proper, I can divide connective tissue proper. What we just did is said it is two main subtypes. You have a loose connective tissue proper, and you have a dense connective tissue proper. Again, all of these contain fibroblasts and fibrocytes. All right. Now, in addition, though, we then subdivided your loose. Your loose got subdivided into an areolar, an adipose, and a reticular. And we then talked about the fibers. They still have fibroblasts, fibrocytes, but we also then talked about some of the other fibers, like reticular fibers making up your reticular. We then introduced dense, and your dense can be divided into a regular and an irregular. And so that's what we've done here in that series of notes. We've taken the main category, subdivided it, and then further subdivided it. You need to do that or be able to do that so you can illustrate and talk about specific then for each one. Okay. The next category of connective tissue is cartilage. Keep in mind for your cartilage, we're made of chondroblasts and chondrocytes. All right. There are a couple things about cartilage. All right. It lacks nerves and it is avascular. So up above, when we talked about cartilage, some connective tissue, that some connective tissue had a good blood supply, some did not. Well, cartilage is an example of a connective tissue that does not have a blood supply. It is avascular and it lacks nerves. All right. So when you blow out a cartilage, when you tear a cartilage, it's not actually the cartilage, all right, that hurts. The cartilage itself doesn't bleed. It's the surrounding damage that you do that is making it painful. The surrounding tissue is bleeding. All right. We have a couple of main types of cartilage. There's hyaline cartilage. Your hyaline cartilage, sometimes you think of as gristle. So that gristle that's in the meat that you eat sometimes, that's essentially what we're thinking of here. Hyaline, it is the most common cartilage in the body. All right. It largely consists of collagen fibers. It provides support, things like that. Your larynx, again, part of your throat or mouth, if you will. The larynx, the rings of the trachea. The ends of your long bone, ribs, your nose, respiratory passages, and even your embryonic skeleton consists of hyaline cartilage. This is sort of the neatest one to me. Much of the skeleton that's hard that you have today started off as hyaline cartilage before it became bone. In addition to hyaline cartilage, there's fibrocartilage. This also contains collagen fibers. They tend to be really thick version of collagen fibers, mainly because their main job is to act as a shock absorber. You find these located in between your vertebra, so your vertebral disc, if you will, and you find them making up your knee, the meniscus of your knee. So again, as you're walking and all this kind of stuff, and your knee is absorbing a lot of shock, it has to do with the fibrocartilage within the knee, between that femur and then your tibia and fibula of the lower leg. That's all fibrocartilage. And last but not least, there is elastic. Obviously, this contains numerous elastic fibers. So a lot of elastic fibers making up elastic cartilage. Again, those elastic fibers provide for strength, but in addition to strength, you get the flexibility associated with the elastic fibers that make it up. The two main places you find your elastic fiber, like your ear, grab your ear and wiggle it all along. Ability to do that, not tearing your ear, but then spring back to like it was, has to do with the elastic cartilage that makes it up. And the epiglottis, again, that's going to be in the throat. Okay, so we've had connective tissue proper that we've subdivided. We had cartilage and all the different types of cartilage. And then we have bone. It gets a little simpler from here. Your bone, unlike cartilage and connective tissue proper, is a very hard structure. It's not flexible very much, all right? It maintains a lot of strength because of the mineralized matrix. So your bone, just like the other tissues we've introduced, consists of living cells. Those living cells are your osteoblasts and osteocytes, but the matrix itself is mineralized. So you have living cells suspended in what ends up being a very hard mineralized matrix. Again, you'll do that some next week when you do visible body. Really hard stuff. I don't spend a bunch of time on bone because we do the whole bone and skeletal system. So you'll get much more detail about that as you go through next week. And then there's fluid connective tissue. I don't cover fluid connective tissue all that much because again, in A&P2, when you introduce the cardiovascular system, that would be heart, you spend an awful lot of time discussing blood. Let me introduce a couple of things. When we talk about your blood, there are living cell types and your non-living matrix. Most of that non-living matrix is the plasma. It is the watery environment. All right, we introduced that. Remember, we talked about the watery compartment making it up. And then there are distinct cell types. Okay, so we talked about the immature cell types. That was those hematopoietic stem cells. And those can then give rise to some distinct other types of cells. So the distinct cell types you find within your blood, number one, you have red blood cells. These may also be called erythrocytes. You will have white blood cells. This is what you call leukocytes. As you go into A&P2, it turns out you'll introduce the 5 distinct types of leukocytes. It's because your white blood cells, these are part of your immune response. It's your bodyguard, if you will. And you have different types providing different types of infections. So think about your white blood cell as your military. And just like your military, you might have a Navy, the Marines, the Special Forces, if you will, an Air Force. All of that is different divisions for different types of battles. And that's the same thing of your white blood cells. In addition to that, I'm wrapping up here in a second, but in addition to that, you have things called thrombocytes. These are what then produce your platelets. Your platelets are essentially cell fragments. They play a role in blood clotting. So you produce platelets so that when you cut yourself, hopefully it will clot. All right. So that wanders through the 4 classes and then subclasses of connective tissue. All right, 4 types of connective tissue and then the distinct subclasses. Remember, you have 4 basic tissues in the body. We just went through epithelial. We just went through connective tissue. To wrap up, I want to cover real quickly muscle and nervous tissue. I do not do this in a ton of detail either because I get you for the entire muscular system and the entire nervous system. So at this point, I am going to introduce the couple of tissues though for each one of these and a main function. You will be responsible for that, but we're going to cover these in a lot more detail so I don't do it very much here. Muscle tissue. There are 4 main muscle tissues in the body. Why do you have muscle? The job of your muscle is for basically movement. All right? Muscle contracts, and when it contracts, it moves stuff. I don't care if it's your skeletal muscle, your cardiac muscle, or your smooth muscle. You have 3 muscle types. There is skeletal muscle, there is cardiac muscle, and there is smooth muscle. And here are some distinct things about each one. Your skeletal muscle is multinucleated. That means each cell has more than 1 nucleus. That's kind of a unique thing about this. All right, it has more than 1 nucleus per cell. Cardiac and smooth muscle are what's called uninucleated. There is only 1 nucleus per cell. Another feature, all right, skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle have striations. Those striations are a result of how protein filaments called actin and myosin overlap. That's what you're seeing when you see a striated skeletal or cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle does not. It is unstriated. It still has those protein filaments called actin and myosin, but they don't overlap the same way, so you see no striations. All right? So a way that you can tell these apart are whether they are striated or not striated. So how do you distinguish between skeletal and cardiac? Well, you can look for the number of nuclei, but cardiac also has, in addition to striations, has a structure called, come on back, also has a structure called an intercalated disc. It is a structure that ties cardiac cells together. All right, it is a structure that ties, it's something you can visually see when you look at that tissue. All right. In addition, one other feature, I'm gonna write it out here, is like we talk about whether you control it or you don't control it. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. It means I have to sit there and say, hey, move my arm. That's a voluntary process. So skeletal muscle is voluntary. Cardiac and smooth muscle are involuntary. You do not have to actively say, hey, heart contract. Your heart beats all by itself. I mean, through the brain doing that. That's part of your autonomic nervous system. It's an involuntary process on your part. All right? So those are some of the features you need to know on the specific types of tissues that fall into the muscle category. Wrapping up, we also have nervous tissue. The job of your nervous tissue is it sends impulses throughout the body. Those impulses fall into one of two categories. There are what's called action potentials and graded potentials. And when we're talking about these, and when I say impulses, you can think of these as voltages. It's like an electrical impulse traveling through your body. Nervous tissue can be divided into two main categories. There are neurons, and the neurons are what actually send the impulses. All right, think about it like the wires in your house. All right, electricity travels along the wire of your house. All right, it's sending the impulse, and that's the neurons. When I say neurons, what you think of and what you've heard of, your nerves. The nerves of your body are made up of neurons, and that's what's sending impulses. But they, just like the wires in this building, they need support. That is called neuroglia or glial cells. The glial cells are what provides support. Whether they anchor, whether they insulate, they help to support your neurons. All right, let me stop that and kind of show you what I mean in that regard. So take this wire. You know that the electricity is traveling along this wire. All right, the wire itself would be like the neuron. However, I'm not getting shocked. It is insulated by the black plastic stuff you see here. That would be the support. And that's the same thing that's true of your nervous tissue. You have the neuron that send the impulses, but you have them supporting cells, neuroglia. It's like the insulating wrapping that surrounds it, or it's the structure that helps provide support. That's the job of those. All right, so those are the four basic tissues. Again, I spend most of the time focusing on epithelial and connective tissue because it's a building block as we get into the skin, and as you go on, as I mentioned, sort of like I said several times, hey, you'll see this for ANP2. Hey, you'll hear this for ANP2. It's a really big picture building block. I don't do muscles and nervous in as much detail, but that is because I get you for those whole organ systems. All right, that's the transition. I wrap up with nervous tissue, and then you get to go on to ANP2. So again, this building block stuff. Okay, so a couple of things, right? This wraps up the information for tissues. All of this is fair game, and I will post a Blackboard quiz later today on the tissue stuff that is due by the end of the day Sunday. All right. We do not have lecture next week We will not have live Zoom meetings next week because I'm out of town and I don't know about the internet service. I assume I can get onto my email. I know I can use my phone, but I can't have a Zoom lecture that way. So I'll be around to try to answer questions if people have them. I am going to post visible body stuff. I will send out an email, covers that information so it doesn't sneak up on you. When we come back that following week, which is the week of July 7th-ish, all right, then we're going to start covering or wrapping up so that you have that test on July 9th. All right, that's all I have for the day. Have a good rest of your week. I will hang out here for a few minutes in case people have questions. Otherwise, that's all I have.